Watanipata mbele. Yeah, so random thoughts. This is the first live stream I'm doing, and I'll be doing a live stream every Friday. I think it's a good way to connect with people and discuss some of the things that I've covered throughout the week, and maybe just have a general conversation. So yeah, so this is going to be, I've done a few live streams, especially on TikTok. I've done like could be 3 live streams on YouTube. I remember I did I think like 2 live streams with somebody else. Then I did like 1 live stream by myself. But those ones, I think the first 2 were like planned live streams. Just had a conversation with someone, and they were like, "Let's do a live stream," and we did 2 live streams. They were planned, but I've not had regular live streams. This is going to be now. I thought about having regular live streams, and I think it's a good idea just to have a live stream. So I'm going to have a YouTube live stream every Friday this time from 7 to maybe 7 to 8 or 8:30 or maybe 9, but generally starting from 7 every Friday. And I think maybe the first one people might not get to join, but over time people are going to get used to that. And I'm also going to have, of course, I've had a few live streams on TikTok. I think I've had more live streams on TikTok than on YouTube. And I'm going to also have a time for TikTok. There was a time I thought it was a good idea to combine the two. It's possible to combine the 2 live streams, to have a live stream that is happening on both YouTube and TikTok and even other platforms. It's possible to have that, but it has its own issues. Of course, there is the setting it up. You need to use some software. It's okay, you can use that software, but I came to realize that when people watch live streams on TikTok, it's a little bit different from people who are watching live streams on YouTube. Yeah, so I'm going to have a live stream every Friday at this time on YouTube. Then I'll have maybe a live stream on TikTok some other time that I'm going to create. So if you've joined me, I welcome you and appreciate you getting the time to join the live stream. If you've not watched me before, of course, on YouTube is Tales in Ancient Books. It's a channel that has been around for a while. On TikTok, it's Random Thoughts. So if you hear me saying random thoughts, it's something that came from TikTok, and maybe some people have seen it and they might be wondering why random thoughts. It's my TikTok handle. Yeah. So what I'm going to do in this live stream is I'm going to do a recap of the things that I've published throughout the week, and that might be the format that I'll be following. But of course, over time, I might have to change depending on what I realize that people prefer. Of course, you start something, then over time you come to realize that people prefer it to be in some way. Yeah, so I will be usually be doing a recap, and then after the recap, then of course I can invite anybody who wants to have a conversation. We can have a conversation. I'm trying to figure out how to, it might not work in this live stream, how to have people jump in and then we have a conversation. If it does not work, we might try. If it does not work this live stream, I will be prepared to do it in the next live stream. Yeah, but I would appreciate anybody who joins. And if you have something you want to say, just write it down. I can read it and then we can have a conversation from there. So maybe I'll start with a recap of some of the things that I've talked about in the last week, but feel free to jump in with a question or a comment. Don't wait for me to finish doing the recap. So the recap this week, I introduced, or I made a little change to how I create content. Of course, as I've said, the content I create on this channel is generally content from books, older books, not new books. Yeah, I might do new books here and there, but generally older books. And when I say older books, initially it used to be thousands of years books. If you go back and check my channel, you realize that the very early content was about books written 1,000 years, 2,000 years. Yeah, and it used to be books from everywhere, but have focused more on colonial documents. These are documents that were generated, let's say, beginning or in the 19th century, early 20th century, such kind of documents. That's what I read. I read those documents, then I create videos, anything interesting from those documents, then I publish the videos. Now, starting this week, I did a little change, or I made some little change. Usually focus on a single book. I read one book for a period, maybe 1 month, 2 months, depending on how big the book is. And then once I'm finished with that book, I move on to the next book. But I decided I'm going to do two books at the same time. That's the beginning of this week. So I'm doing two books at the same time. And the reason why I decided to do that actually is because I realized that I'm having two clearly different audiences, both here on YouTube and also on TikTok. I have people who follow mostly what you can call the Horn of Africa history. Because when we say the Horn of Africa, Kenya can be and might be not the part of the Horn of Africa. There are people who want to see content about Somalia, Ethiopia, maybe Eritrea and Djibouti, that kind of content. And it's a huge audience here and also on TikTok. And there are people who are interested in me reading documents that talk about Kenya, Uganda, and when I talk of Kenya, I mean like talk of Kenya, the western side of Kenya and such documents, and then Uganda and maybe Tanzania. I've not done so much of Tanzania. So I decided I'm going to do two books. See, when I focus on just one book, then I run into the problem of there are people who want to see that content of say Somalia and Ethiopia. And when I focus on content that is talking, for example, Western Kenya, then they are not interested really. Then they'll have to wait for me to finish that book before they can get content that they find interesting. And I decided, why not just do two books at the same time? So for example, right now I'm reading C.W. Hobley's book, Kenya from a Chartered Company to a Crown Colony. Now, this is a book that was published 1929, and C.W. Hobley was a colonial administrator. He came to Kenya in 1890, actually, and he was brought by the Imperial British East Africa Company. And then when the company handed over the East Africa Protectorate, which later on became Kenya in 1894 to the British government, he joined the civil service. He became a district commissioner. He became a provisional commissioner, and he stayed around for quite some time, actually, for close to 30 years. So that's the book I'm reading, and there are very interesting stories in that book. Of course, beginning in coast, going to Western Kenya, coming to central Kenya, especially Ukambani, and then going back to the coast. Very interesting stories from 1890s to 1900s. Very interesting stories that I'm getting, and I'm sharing those. The second book I'm reading, and I just started reading that book, is the second book that will go together with C.W. Hobley's book, is a book by Douglas Collins that was published in, would be 1960. And Douglas Collins was a British officer who came to East Africa in around 1940s, and he was sent to Somalia, and he became an administrator, also a district commissioner. He stayed there for close to 10 years, and then he wrote this book explaining or describing his stay in Somalia. So I'm going to do those two books at the same time. Once I finish one of the two, I'll replace it with a more similar book. If I'm going to finish C.W. Hobley book first, I'm going to find a book that is almost similar to C.W. Hobley's book. If I'm going to finish Douglas Collins' book first, I'm going to find a similar. And I have a long list, actually. And I have to thank people who have been suggesting books. People have been suggesting, even Douglas Collins' book is someone who suggested the book. So I have a long list of books that I want to go through. I have someone who asks the question, and I'm going to answer you. You say, why do you stress that people and language are unrelated? Did Bantu speakers adopt their languages? Yeah, I've also done a lot of videos around this, and um, I usually or often run into problems with some people when I make such statements. And if you don't know what, I think your name is you have RB. I can RBW88K. Yeah. So if you don't know what he's talking about, so that I create the context for those who are watching and might be lost what we are discussing, or what the question is about, is asking why. Usually, if you watch my videos, I usually say that language and people are not necessarily the same thing. And that seems to be an idea that most people struggle with. And the reason why I say that is because when people say Bantu people, uh, people automatically assume there are people or there is a DNA that is Bantu. And I know I've seen so many writings online and content that seems to suggest that there is a Bantu DNA, there is a Cushitic DNA, there is an Nilotic DNA. And I'm not saying that entirely that you should separate language from people. But what is very clear is that people don't carry language in their DNA. They don't. There is no study that will tell you that you carry a certain language in your DNA. You don't. Language is something we learn. We are born into a family that speaks a certain language, and we start using that language. And if we are born in a language that uses a certain language, and then we are moved from that family or adopted from to another family that speaks a different language, guess what? We are going to start speaking the language of the family where we grow up. If we did have language in our DNA, what that means is that if you are born to parents who have a Kikuyu DNA, for example, it does not matter where you will be brought up, whether you be brought up by parents who are Americans, you should speak Kikuyu naturally because it is in your DNA. But it's not. That's not what happens, because language is not in the DNA. Language is learned. That's so obvious. I don't know why it's even an issue. So obvious that we learn language. Now, to tie in where the people have an issue with me is because of these groupings of languages. Bantu is a grouping of languages. At least that's the person who started it, the person who created that terminology of Bantu was not speaking of people, he was speaking of languages. And if you read those old documents that speak of language classifications, they talk of Bantu languages, Cushitic languages, Nilotic languages, and of course, all the other groupings of languages across Africa. Of course, the Cushitic and the Bantu and the Nilotic are the language groups mostly found in East Africa. But of course, the rest of Africa have their own groupings. So back to the question, why do you say that people and language are unrelated? It's because they are actually unrelated. You don't have language in your DNA. Language is something you learn. And Cushitic, Bantu, and Nilotic, those are language groups. They are not genetic groups. But some people have started making it seem like they are genetic groups. They are not, if you ask me. They are not genetic groups. They are language groups. So if we are going to talk of Bantu being a genetic group, we need a new study. We need a new formula, a new scientific framework so that we do that. But we can't take a language group that was established in, say, 19th century. Most of these language groups were established in the 19th century. And then we just take that, borrow that, and say, oh, there is a Bantu DNA. There is a Cushitic DNA. That does not make sense to me. I don't know whether we follow. So the reason I say they are not related is because we learn language. We are not born with language. We are born into a society that speaks a certain language, then we become that. So when you say Bantus, does a Somali who is born into a family that speaks Swahili become a Bantu, carry a Bantu DNA? No, they don't. They carry a Somali DNA or some DNA that is of those people, but them speaking Swahili does not give them so-called Bantu DNA. They just adopt a language that they find people using. Rosion, three Rosion, greetings, greetings. Thank you for coming in. Then you follow up. So people adopted their native language. Exactly. What is a native language? Because yes, when you think of a native language, you're just thinking in terms of the last 200, 300 years. But languages evolve. People embrace and abandon languages. Right now, most Kenyans are abandoning their so-called native languages for Swahili and English. So 300-400 years down the road, Swahili will be a native language, and then there will be another language that comes in. Then you'll be like, oh, we are Swahilis because we speak Swahili. And in fact, Swahili was a language that came up at the coast by combination of some other Bantu languages and Arabic, and then a new language emerged, and people started speaking Swahili. So the so-called native language emerged at some point. Remember, you as a person, you have a genealogy that goes back for even hundreds of thousands of years. So you think your ancestors for hundreds thousands of years have been speaking the language you think is your native language? Just think about that for a moment. You think your ancestors who've been for say 10,000 years have been speaking, let's say you speak Kikuyu, have been speaking that for 10,000 years? No. At some point, that language you think is your native language came in, and your ancestors abandoned another language. Maybe it's no longer even in existence. They took that language, and this language is going to disappear, but the people are going to be there. The people are going to be adopting other languages. Yes, they adopted the so-called native languages. They were adopted. Where did the Bantu speakers borrow their language? It's hard to tell when they borrow their language or even where the languages came from. Of course, when you say Bantu speakers, there are so many languages that fall under that category. Hundreds, I think thousands of languages fall into the category of Bantu languages. And that itself should tell you something, because if you meet a Kisi, a Kikuyu, a Kuria, a Kamba, they all speak Bantu languages. But even them, they will tell you, seems like there was a time we used to speak a language, a common language. But then at some point, that has evolved. Now we speak languages that Akamba and Akizi will struggle understanding one another, even though they are Bantu languages. Why? They will say that the language, at some point, there is a parent language that used to be spoken, but seems like that language, of course, got lost, or it evolved and people moved, embraced other languages, mixed it up with their language, so that the people who spoke the other language, when you meet 300 years later, you don't understand one another. Like the language has become. Then you say, So I know we might not agree, but that's what I think about it. So as far as when the Bantu speakers borrow their language, nobody can tell you for sure. Nobody can tell you. But if you look carefully, you realize that at some point, these people spoke or this language emerged at some point. But the people have always been there. Like, if you are alive today and human beings have been around for 100,000 years, there is no break for you to be here today. There is a chain that goes back for 100,000. You can't say that you specific as a person, your genealogy emerged somewhere in between here. No, you have always been there. It's just that the languages have changed. The languages have been embraced, have been created, abandoned, destroyed, forgotten. Yeah, so that's the point. Yeah, so going back to the recap I was doing, and people can join in and ask questions and contribute. Going back to the recap, I was talking about that I've decided to do 2 books at the same time to take care of the different, especially becoming clearly 2 different groups of people who watch my content. I can see that in the videos and the data that I get, that I have 2 very distinct groups of people who are consuming my content, and trying to assume that I'm going to create content that the 2 groups can like is very difficult. So I've decided to do. So that started this week. So I introduced that new way of creating content, looking at 2 books at the same time. And now, yeah, so this week I've created a few videos. Of course, I introduced A Tear for Somalia by Douglas Collins as the new book, and I've told you who that person is. And so far, very interesting videos I've created. People are engaging with the videos, and yeah, it seems like people are liking the book. And then I did a video about, and from that book, one of the videos that has done very well from the book is a video about who is a Somali, and there is a part very early on in the book where Douglas Collins tells us of who he came to see as a Somali. And I think it's resonated with so many people, especially people who are Somali, talking about their behavior, their mindset, their outlook, their way of life, trekking, and yeah, and I found it to be very interesting. And I picked some things that, a specific thing that I picked out of it that I found to be very interesting is that when you don't have food to eat, no, when you have food to eat but you don't have water to drink, you are better off not eating the food, because eating the food will make you be thirsty, and being thirsty is worse than being hungry. Yeah, that's something I picked from Who is a Somali, because that is the wisdom of the Somalis, to live in a very harsh environment where there is no source of water. Like getting water is, in that part of the world, is not as easy. Now, another video I did that I realized that did very well is how the British used the Maasai as an excuse to take land from the Kikuyu. Very fertile land, very good land. When the British came, and this is from C.W. Hobley's book, the British wanted land, and the first land they liked, of course, is the land in Kikuyu today, Kiambu, those sides. They liked the land very much, but there were people already on the land. There were Kikuyus on the land, there were Maasais on the land, but then they decided that they wanted that land, and they needed a justification for that. And the justification was that there was fighting a lot between the Kikuyu and the Maasai, and so they decided to take that land. And the justification was they were creating a buffer zone. Yeah, so they did that. Then they took tens of thousands, thousands of acres of land, which became the Limuru part, or that site where there is a lot of coffee and tea plantations. They took that land with the justification that they were building or creating a buffer zone between the Maasai and Kikuyu. But very interestingly, the Kikuyu and the Maasais are very much related. Yeah, again, we go back to the classification of Bantu and Nilotes. Of course, the Maasais are considered to be Nilotes and the Kikuyu are considered to be Bantu. When now you forget that the Bantu and Nilote is about language, you run into the problem of not realizing that Kikuyus and Maasais are very related, very related. And in fact, I think I read a book, it could be a book by Richard Maynard Sagen. This is a guy is mostly known to be the person who led the expedition that ended up killing Koitalel Arap Samoei, the high priest of the Nandi Republic. And he talks about meeting a certain Akikuyu chief. He calls him chief, even though, of course, the people do not call them chiefs. And he was talking to him and he was asking him about the origin of his people, the Akikuyu. And he told him the Akikuyu are related to the Maasai, and they are related to the Akamba, and they are related to the Ndorobo. Then Maynard Sagen, of course, dismisses that and says, oh, there is no way these people are related. The Kikuyu are Bantu and the Maasai are Nilotes. And then he uses the correct terminology. So he says the Kikuyu are Bantu speakers and the Maasai are Nilotic speakers. But now what gets lost there is the fact that those are just languages. Those are not the people, the DNA. Those are just languages. But anyway, the Maasai and the Kikuyu are very much related. And when you read, I think I've read C.W. Hobley's The Bantu Magic and Beliefs, and he brings that up that among the Kikuyu, there were the Kikuyu, the Maasai, and the Kikuyu, the Kikuyu. They used to speak the Kikuyu language, but within the people themselves, they will tell you those are Maasais, those are Kikuyus, but they speak Kikuyu. And then they have their own initiation way. These ones have their own initiation way. And then there were ways to transfer your allegiance from Kikuyu to Kikuyu Maasai, or Kikuyu Maasai to Kikuyu. Anyways, the point I was making about was this video about the British using the Maasai as a justification to take away the land from the Kikuyu by saying that they were creating a buffer zone. But meanwhile, these two groups of people are very related, and I mean genetically, not just genetically, they shared blood a lot. But yeah, so that video was interesting for me personally, and I think very many people connected with it. And then I did a video, and this was a sort of a unique video I've not done. I usually don't do this kind of videos. And it's about a book I ran into, and it's a book titled Africa's First Democrats, Aden A. Osman and Abdirazak Hussein. Now, this is a book written by one Abdi Ismail Samatan, or Samatar. Now, this book, as the title says, Samatar is trying to say that these two gentlemen, Aden Osman and Abdirazak Hussein, were Africa's first Democrats. And he makes a very good argument, which actually makes a lot of sense, that actually these two people are very fast Democrats. And the reason he says they were very fast Democrats is because they, 1964, I think, or 1965, Aden was the first president of Somalia, and Abdirazak was the prime minister under that government. And then there were elections, and they lost. They lost the elections. And in the 1960s, mid-1960s, they conceded defeat, actually, and they handed over presidency to somebody else. I think it could be Shamarke, if I'm not wrong. They handed over the presidency to somebody else. And that was, I think at that time, it did not seem like a big deal because most African countries were becoming independent or getting their independence. But later on, looking at what has happened throughout the years, the 60s, the late 60s, and the 90s, the 70s, and the 80s, and the 90s, where presidents, somebody in power, became very difficult for them to lose an election. It became a formality that if somebody is a president, there is an election, it's just a formality. They are not going to lose the elections. But these two gentlemen lost an election in the 1960s, and they gave up the presidency. And that's why he calls them Africa's first Democrats. Very interesting book. I'll encourage you to find a copy and read. And he makes a lot of, and something else that pulled me into reading that book or looking at that book is there is the Somali Youth League. It's an organization that I've heard a lot. It's like the Kenya African Union, KAU in Kenya, like that very first political party that organized the people for independence. It's the same thing. The Somali Youth League was that. And that book discusses the Somali Youth League in detail. And if you want to understand the Somali Youth League, I think that this could be one of the books that you could go and read. Yeah, so I did that video. It was just sort of a review. I'm still reading the book. I'm not going to do videos like I do from the other books because it is a copyright minefield. It might not allow me to do screenshot because the books I read are books that the copyrights are more flexible because the books have been around for a while. So if you screenshot, you don't risk running into issues. Yeah, another book, another video I did this week that I think very many people resonated with is a video about the push in the 1910s and maybe possibly 1920s to make Kenya an independent white country. Yeah, so it was very, and this came from C.W. Hobley's book, Kenya from a Chartered Company to a Crown Colony. When you read history from this today, we usually don't realize that actually the white settlers in Kenya, the Europeans who had settled on the land, were interested in Kenya becoming independent, but they were not interested in Kenya becoming independent in that the Africans become citizens. No, no, no. They were interested in it becoming, say, like Australia or the US, where the Europeans become the citizens and they manage. It stops being a colony, it becomes an independent country. We could say maybe like South Africa was at some point, where the whites become the citizens and the blacks are just there. So there was that push, and I did that video, and very many people resonated with that. And then, of course, another one from Hobley is about Hobley Estate in Mombasa. This one I did not get from the book. Of course, I'm reading C.W. Hobley's book, but somebody brought it up to me that actually there is an estate in Mombasa called Hobley Estate. And at this point in the book, I'm moving to the chapter where he talks about his stay in Mombasa as a commissioner. There was the first part of the book where he talks about his stay in Mombasa as an employee of the Imperial British East Africa. But then now there is this other part where now he's gone to Western Kenya, he's going to come to Naivasha, and then he's transferred to the coast. And this chapter he talks about his work in Mombasa. Now somebody brought it up to me that actually there is an estate in Mombasa called Hobley Estate. I think it's around Tononoka, somewhere around there. And actually, the most interesting thing about that is that there is a affordable housing project going on there. That houses are being built. And actually, I went to the official website of the affordable housing, the government project. They call it Bomayangu. And the estate is actually listed as Hobley Estate. So when I saw that, I was wondering, did the people who are in charge of the affordable housing project, did they pick the name carefully, or they just found a name on the ground and they ran with it? And if they picked it carefully, what does that say? Are they celebrating Hobley? Of course, Hobley was a colonial administrator, and I'm not saying he was an evil person, but he was a colonial administrator. Some of the things that he did were things that we cannot celebrate him. For example, he is the guy who was in the forefront, or who was given the responsibility of actually moving the Maasai from their land in Naivasha, Nakuru, and taking them to Laikipia. He was like the center person. And what he did there, he basically lied to the Maasai. He told them, we're going to give you new land in Laikipia, and we're also going to give you money. Now, they never saw the money, not a shilling. They were given land in Laikipia, but that land was later on again taken away and given to something called the East African Syndicate. So that land was taken. In fact, the best part in Laikipia was taken and given to the East African Syndicate, a group of Europeans mostly who came mostly from South Africa, but there were others who joined them from the UK. Yeah, so Hobley played a major role there. So he lied to the Maasai, he tricked them, he conned them of their land, and now we have an estate in Mombasa named after him, Hobley Estate. So I don't know whether the people at affordable housing, whatever team, knew of the name or have thought of the name, or it's just like, oh, we just found a name on the ground, Hobley, we are going to call it Hobley. Somebody says the ancient pharaoh were originally from the land of Punt, currently Somalia. Yeah, so I did a video where I talked about the land of Punt, and this was what was written by Douglas Collins, but it did not come from him. It came from a British officer who welcomed them to Mogadishu, and he was explaining to them the land, and he told them, "Oh, this land is called the land of Punt, and this is how the Egyptians called it." That's what he said. Now, of course, the land of Punt, it's mentioned in the writings of ancient Egyptians. And of course, most scholars agree that the land of Punt is somewhere where Somalia is today. Maybe the entire land, maybe part of it, nobody can say for sure. but what is almost everybody is agreeing on is that the land of Punt was there. And the Egyptian knew of the land of Punt, and seems like they had a lot of link to the land of Punt. They did trade together. Culturally, they intermingled somehow. Seems like the land of Punt was a land that was very much well known in ancient Egypt, and somehow was celebrated in the land by the ancient Egyptians. So yeah, so there is that. There is that the land of Punt is where Somalia is today, or at least some part of it. You say, and I'm sorry, I can't get your name, GHST4487. You continue to say, I have ancient pharaohs coins and crafts that I found in Somalia. That's very interesting. That's very interesting. If you have such artifact, that's very interesting. And probably there's a lot more that can be found out if there is more studies done in that area. Yeah, some people have said there are pyramids that are hidden in Somalia. Possibly there are. I read, is it Douglas Jardine's book, The Mad Mullah of Somaliland? He talks about ancient ruins in some parts of British Somaliland there. And he attributed some of those ruins to the same people probably who built Egyptian pyramids or ruins, things like that. Yeah, so I think there's a lot that is around that region that we don't know. Maybe you are going to know with time. How pyramids built, I don't know how pyramids were built. Nobody can explain that for sure. Now, you are saying Bantus were part of Punt. Now, when you say Bantus, now that's where we have a difficult topic at hand, because what exactly do we mean by Bantus? Who are Bantus? I know very many people would be very uncomfortable or not happy with that, me asking that question. Who are Bantus exactly? Are we talking of Bantu speakers? Or who are Bantus? Who are these people we call Bantus? Because Bantu is a language classification. I think that's important for us to clarify what we mean by Bantu. Then now we can go into discussing, were these people part of the ancient Punt? You're saying modern Bantu speakers. I don't know. To be honest, I don't know I don't know what to say about that, because as I said earlier, Bantu is a language classification, and nobody has language in their DNA. Nobody. All of us are born without language. We learn a language as a tool that helps us mix or build societies. So language is something we learn. It's not something in our DNA. So there's no language is going to define who we are when it comes to genetics. It doesn't. At least when we look at it in the bigger picture. Of course, in the smaller periods, we might say, language defines who we are. But in the bigger picture, language does not define who we are, genetically speaking. Socially, it can. Socially, it can define who we are socially. But genetically, no way, it can't happen. You say, do you know about ancient India? Not so much, to be honest. I don't know so much about ancient India. I've not read a lot about it. I have general understanding. I was reading about this dynasty that came from the north and ruled India for a very long time until the British came around. I'm forgetting they called there's a name they are called. There's a name they are called. It's just escaped my mind. But I don't want to say that I've read a lot about the ancient Indian. I've read things here and there, interesting stuff, but I wouldn't say that I'm competent to discuss the history of ancient India. I am not. I've read very interesting stuff. For example, I can mention, I was reading Maimonides. He's a philosopher, he's not an historian. Maimonides' book, The Guide for the Perplexed. and he was discussing about Maimonides lived around, could be 1,000 years ago. He was born in Spain, and then he moved to Morocco, and then he moved to Egypt. He became a personal physician for Saladin, the ruler of Egypt, and then he died. He was buried in the Palestine land. He talks about a book that he read. It's called The Nabatean Agriculture, but the book seems like no longer exists today. Now he tells us what was in that book, and part of the story he tells us is the story of the Sabaeans. These are people who are found in the Horn of Africa and then in Yemen, those sides. Now he talks of the Sabaeans as the people from which Abraham came from, but then he tells the story of Adam, and there's a way he explains, and he actually says himself, this knowledge is very dangerous, the way he says in the book. Then he talks of India in that context as Adam coming from India, something of sort. It's such a messed up story anyway. But anyway, the short answer is that I don't know much about ancient India. Do you consider Kikuyu Bantus? I consider them Bantu speakers. Yes, you have to put speakers there, because there is something I've realized, especially with the Kikuyu people. The Kikuyu people, just like these other groups of people, are an emerging community from others who existed before. And all these other groups are the same. They are often a mixture, actually. Often a mixture. You can say the same for Masa, you can say the same for Somali, you can say the same for Luos, you can say the same for Kalenjin. They are, especially the Kalenjin, I read somewhere where there is a talk of a mixture of people around Mount Elgon, the Souk and different groups from Uganda and from the north, and then they mix up in Mount Elgon. And then there is a merging new group of people called the Kalenjin. Not actually the Kalenjin, by the way. The Nandi, the Kipsigis, they emerged from that place, because the Kalenjin also is a very recent creation, by the way, 1940s. There was nothing like Kalenjin group. There was these different groups who spoke languages that were close, and then but they were a mixture of other people. Now, the same case for Kikuyu, they are a mixture of other people. The Tagichu, the Basi, those other people, even them, they mention them. They mixed up and they created a new society, just like most of these other groups. Sometimes we assume, this story of people emerging from the same ancestor, and is told in almost every group. But I've come to realize most of that is often not. It's just a story. It's a myth. People just meet as a new society. Often the so-called tribes are political organizations that formed, republics and monarchies that formed. Then they adopted the same language, same culture, same belief system. They became one people. Just like Kenyans now, 100, 200 years, you'll assume they are the same people. But yeah, so Kikuyu are Bantu speakers. They speak a Bantu language. They speak a Bantu language. You see there are several. I think we retracted that. Ashkenazis was saying Adam and Eve landed in northern Somalia, but I don't know if that's true. Yeah, these stories, like I said with Maimonides' story, initially when somebody used to say the Horn of Africa could be actually the land where the stories like Adam, especially Abraham, let's not even go to Adam. I could have said, oh no, there's no, but now I think it's very much possible. Anyway, it's very much possible. Yeah, so the story of Adam and Eve landed in others. Anything is possible. Then you say Somalis are not Bantu speakers. Yes, it depends. A Somali who speaks Swahili is a Bantu speaker. A Somali who speaks Kikuyu, and there are those who do actually, who speaks Kikuyu becomes a Bantu speaker. Especially a Somali who speaks only Swahili, then he's a Bantu speaker. Yeah, so we need to be very careful with how we use those words. When you just say Bantu, then we don't know what we are talking about. When we say Bantu speaker, then we become a little bit clear of what we are talking about. Then it is easier for us to maneuver those things. Like we say Bantu speaker, then you're like, so what is a Somali who speaks Swahili and Swahili only? Then it becomes a Bantu speaker because they speak Swahili, and Swahili is a Bantu language. And then saying Abi, so I'm new in this channel. Yeah, welcome. Yeah, welcome, and hopefully you subscribed. Yeah, I talk about such kind of stuff in the videos, and you can look around. Yeah, I talk about such kind of stuff. Tresorim, can you share with us what Obwenge means? No, I don't know what that means. I don't know what Obwenge means. You can explain, elaborate. Karuni Joseph Mwaura, hello, welcome, karibu sana. And then you say those are Somalis that live in Kenya. Yes, Somalis who live in Kenya speak Swahili. I think that's what you are talking about. Yeah, so Somalis who live in Kenya speak Swahili, and some of them, I think, it's sizable, especially those who are born in Mombasa and raised in Mombasa or Nairobi or Nakuru. They will end up speaking Swahili more than Somali. And what does that make them? Then they become a Bantu speaker because Swahili is a Bantu language. I'm just using that to illustrate something, that we need to add speakers, and again, we need to just know that language is not in the DNA. Language has very little to do with your DNA. Yeah, language is a learned thing. Your DNA, you get it naturally. You are born with the DNA from your parents, but you are not born with the language. You are taught the language. It's a cultural thing. Yeah, so yes. So the Somalis who are born in Kenya speak Swahili, very much so. Yeah, what else did I do this week that I found to be very interesting, or I realized people liked it? And then I talked about Mogadishu in the 1940s. Yeah, very interesting. Douglas Collins, in his book, describes the day-to-day life in Mogadishu in a very interesting way. People working and entertainment and all that. And 1940 Mogadishu is a very, very different Mogadishu, I guess, from maybe Mogadishu of today, or maybe Mogadishu of, let's say, 20 years or 30 years before. Very different society. And definitely, I'll even compare it. When Douglas Collins describes to us Mogadishu in 1941, now let me compare it to Mogadishu that is described by Bin Battuta. And Bin Battuta, when was that? Could be 13th century or 12th century, around there. Very different Mogadishu. Mogadishu of Ibn Battuta was a very religious Mogadishu. Very religious, very traditional, very strict. You can say it's the way he explains it. People are very modest. Then you look at Mogadishu of 1941, not very religious, at least how Collins describes it, not very religious, not people are not modest. He talks about alcohol and all kinds of things happening in the city, brothels and things like that. Things that Ibn Battuta did not bring up, but even the way he describes the religious practices of the time, there is no way there was. Maybe there was, but maybe it was in very backstreet in the Ibn Battuta time. There's no way there was going to be a brothel. If there were, they were maybe very backstreet, not in the main society, like it is when you see Collins described in the city, like even the headquarters of very important organizations were in the middle of brothels. That's 1940s Mogadishu. Very different, very different. Yeah, so I did talk about that. And yeah, I see there are more comments. Kieser, I hope I'm getting your name right. As a Kikuyu, I find many Bantu languages familiar. For example, I can understand about 60% of Kinyarwanda. The same case applies to many Bantu languages closer than English and Germanic languages. Yeah, those languages, they are very close, but it depends. Some are closer, of course, than others. You can say Kamba and Kikuyu are closer than, say, Kamba and Kisi, or Kisi and Luya, or Kisi and Kuria is closer than, say, Kuria and Meru. Yeah. So, but yeah, generally, somebody speaks a Bantu language in Kenya. If he has a Zulu speaking Zulu, they can pick what they are saying. They can get the general idea of what they are saying because it's a Bantu language. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but the focus is on the language, not the DNA, the language. The language. That means these languages at some point, or they originated from a single language. And then people moved with the language, and when people separate, language evolves, because language is not the size, it's not in the DNA. Language evolves. We as we move along, we take language and add new things, text things. Like, language evolves over time because we shape it according to the need. It's just a tool we shape according to how we need to use it at this moment. And if some parts of it become unuseful, we drop that. If we need to include new things to make this language useful, we add. And I think it's because of that and people separating, then we have all these languages. Yeah, as you pointed out, the Germanic languages, the same thing. Yeah, you say language is a cultural thing. I have seen Asians speak fluent. Yeah, it is. Language is a culture. It's not in the DNA. It's a cultural thing. And yes, that's why you'll find Asians speak fluent Kikuyu, and you go to Kisii, there are Asians who speak Kisii better than many Kisis, especially those who are not in Kisii. They speak that language very well. It's a cultural thing. Yeah, it's not in the DNA. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, and I think we agree on that. That is a cultural thing. And when you start seeing it as a cultural thing, then you might have a shift in the way you understand history. Especially, I did a video where I was saying that the story of Kikuyus coming from, I don't know, West Africa, at least directly, becomes very difficult to get, to buy, at least. Especially, I was reading, I think it's Maina Sagen again, and I've mentioned him. He was asking some Kikuyu elders this is a late 19th century, early 20th century. He was asking them, so where did your people come from? And they tell him, our people came from the north. They don't say the west. They clearly say they came from the north. But now you start focusing that language and DNA are the same, then there's no way you are going to marry that. You're going to match that they say their people came from the north, because you are focusing so much on the story that has been told that the Bantu people came from the west. But it possibly is only the language that came from the west, not the DNA. The language was just embraced. Sufficient, you say Mogadishu or Mogadishu in Somali means Moksite, and disown killer, meaning binding beauty. Okay. I did do a video a while back looking at the different names of Mogadishu. Could be a year ago. Yeah, it's very interesting. And the name is one of the cities that have a name that can be spelled in so many ways. That's another interesting fact about Mogadishu. You're asking, what language did Bantu speakers switch from? We don't have records about that. We don't know. We don't know which language they spoke, but they must have spoken a language. Otherwise, how do you explain for, say, 100,000 years? At least let's say 10,000 years, because when you say 100,000 years, some people will have issues with that. But for sure, 10,000 years, we can agree. Do you think the language your people speak today is the language your ancestors have spoken for 10,000 years? Just give it a moment. Think about it. Do you think so? And if so, what does that mean? Does that mean that people are not related human beings? because the general understanding that all human beings are related. But then why are we speaking different languages? Of course, there is the wisdom in the Bible, for example, where there is an attempt to explain that and say, oh, there was this building of the Tower of Babel, and then people, maybe there is some truth in that. There's some truth in that, but it's an analogy that maybe we don't get today. But if you say, oh, our people have been, let's say you are Kikuyu, my ancestors for 10,000 years have been speaking Kikuyu. What does that mean? Does that mean that Kikuyus are not related with the other humans? For sure they are. All people come from the same path. Then what does that say about the language? I would argue that, for example, most of these Bantu languages, most likely the current form likely is not more than 2,000 years. The current form, most likely. I'm not so, don't quote me on that. I'm just speculating. You're saying maybe many East Africans were ancient Egyptians, and when they say they are from the northern, it might be true. Yes, actually, yeah. Very many East Africans talk of the north. They don't talk of, and we might ignore that and be like, oh, they don't know what they are talking about. But I think you can't tell people something that they insist that they are from the north, and you want to tell them, no, you are not from the north, you are from elsewhere. At least they knew something. Yeah, it's possible they came from the north. And if they came from the north, from ancient Egypt, again, that leaves us with questions about the language. What was happening with the language? Yeah, what was happening with the language? There's something there that can be, yeah, anyways. So yeah, so I did Mogadishu 1940s, and then I did a video that has connected to so many people, and is about the use of Abyssinian prisoners to police Somalis. And this is again from Douglas Collins' book. Yeah, so there was that. Douglas Collins goes to Mogadishu, he's given 30 men, all of them were Abyssinian prisoners who had been put in prison by the Italians. And he's told, go with these guys and they're going to be your Askaris. He goes with them to is it called Afgoye, southern Somalia. But they mess big time. And in fact, I did a video about that, but I did not publish it. And then I realized I deleted it before I published it. And they do a big mess. I'm not going to say what happened here because I still plan to record a video about that. They did a big mess and they were chased from Jubaland. They were chased and they went back to Abyssinia. Yeah, so yeah, there's that. Of course, I did the part where I said, oh, they were taken to Afgoye. I think it's called Afgoye. But then there's another video I'm going to do where I explain them being chased away back to Abyssinia. Yeah, so that's the week. I think the last video I did this week is about the question of whether Mogadishu was at some point ruled by Arabs, because there's a video I did and some people did not like the fact that I mentioned that at some point there is a possibility that Mogadishu was ruled by Arabs. So people kind of like got offended, and I did a video, actually published it today, discussing or speculating on that. I don't know how people are going to engage with the video, but yeah, it's a very complex question. You can go watch the video. It's a very complex question. RBWH8K, you can't say Bantu speaker switch from another language if you can't tell us what it was. I can't tell you which language, but I can just look at the bigger picture of history, and some things don't make sense to me, at least personally. We might disagree. Personally, it does not make sense that that language has always been there. And another thing, which I think you'll agree with me, is that people are switching languages. And I think we also avoid, and I used to be in that kind of thinking of the current era to be special. I think there's a term for it. Every generation thinks that what is happening within their generation is special in history. But until I read Herodotus' book, published like 2,500 years ago. Yes, it is. Until I read Titus Livius, a collection of books, huge collection of books that is written around 2,000 years. Until I read these old books, historical books, then some things became, then I realized actually, whatever is happening today is not unique. It's how things have happened throughout history. For example, what many people think it's unique, people think it's unique that people speaking different languages have been put together in a commonwealth like Kenya. And now they are learning one language, Swahili, and they are abandoning their languages, the native languages. They are now taking this language. Very many people think that this is unique in history, that it's never happened before. But when you read these old documents, history, you realize actually that's what has been happening throughout. For example, the Romans, the ancient Romans, they came from the Latins. The Latins were actually a combination of initially two groups of people, and the language, they formed a new language, the Latin language out of that, the Trojans and a local tribe in the Italian peninsula. And then when Rome was founded, there were all these people. I think when you read Levy's book and you try to count, the different groups of people will reach maybe 100. Different, we can call them tribes, with their own languages, with their own cultures, beliefs, and everything. All these people moved to Rome. And over time, they abandoned, forgot their languages, and they contributed to the language that became the language of Rome. And they formed a new society. So today, when you think of Romans, you think of them as one people, but these are people who were built together for a very long time. When you read Herodotus' book, he talks about the people we know today as the Iranians, actually, the Persians, and I think I'm forgetting the media people. These people joined and other groups joined and they formed the Persian society with a unique language, unique belief system, unique culture. But he gives you the breakdown and then you realize this thing has been happening throughout history. So today you think, oh, before Kenya became what it is, people used to be born in a certain community and they speak only that language. It has never happened before that actually a society was formed by people from different groups. And I was going to tell you something else. You said, if I can't tell you that, I should. How do you explain the different clans in Luo land and Kalenjin land and Kisii, the same clans, and Luya land? While Luyas and Kisis are Bantus, Luos and Kipsigis are Nilos. How do you explain those clans? And I want you to go and investigate those clans, the shared clans. How do you explain them? If you explain them to me, then of course I will be like, yeah. Yeah, you say, yeah, let's agree to disagree on that. Nobody else. No, I'm not going to answer you on that. It is weird that most genetically diverse people have simple language group. It's not adding up. Yeah, I don't know what you mean by simple. Most people genetically diverse have simple language group. Which simple language group? You can substantiate that. I think there's somebody up there. Bantu languages is a myth. Taito, you say Bantu languages is a myth. Songa, Mozambique, and Ashiwambo, Namibia are incomprehensible to most South Africans. I would go as far as to call them a myth, but I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Like sometimes languages are forced to join. Maybe sometimes it's just borrowed words, but then they are like, oh, because they have similar words here, let's put them. I see what you mean. I think you make a very valid point here. Yeah, that there's a possibility languages are grouped together simply because one language borrowed words from another. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I think I need to go, and I appreciate everyone that joined, and Appreciate everybody that joined. I'm going to do this every Friday. Of course, the format might change with time. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to have people show up in video, and then we have the conversations in video, like back and forth. I think that would be a better way to have these conversations. You writing and me talking, yeah, it works, but I think if we can have like talking about having a video, I think it will work. RW88K, I don't know what you mean, to be honest. I don't know what you mean. I don't know what you mean by that. I don't know. I don't get it. Roscion, yes, thanks. Enjoy your weekend too. Let's talk next Friday. Thank you.